You want another one? Fish?
Yeah.
If you saw last week's video, then you know that it actually turned out to be a pretty good day. There's a fish. There we go, we're hooked up to a good one. And it actually kind of surprised me because going into the day, it seemed like we had a lot against us. We've got a super high tide. As you can see, things are pretty muddy. We've got a pretty dang big storm system headed our way. The wind shifted directions on us and really picked up. If you didn't get a chance to watch that video, then you can click up there in the link and give that a watch. It might help before you watch this video. If you've been following my channel for a few weeks, then you probably have realized that I'm kind of an analytical type of person. I like to look back on my past fishing trips and really try to break them down and see what went wrong, and in this case, what went right. So I thought it would be kind of cool for this video to look at last week's trip and really analyze a few analytics and see if we can come up with some kind of a trend or some kind of a pattern, figure out why it is that these fish were biting when it seemed like it was lining up to be a pretty poor day. Hey, are you killing my tomato plant?
Yeah.
Don't do that, you little turkey. So for last week's fishing trip, I want to break it up and look at Saturday morning and then Saturday evening and see what was going on with some of these other factors during those times. So the date was May 29th, which means late spring, getting into early summer, and that means things like the water is warming up and it's causing these fish to become more aggressive. It means that our tides are getting higher and lower. We're just having a greater fluctuation in the tide. And it means that we're in a spring weather pattern. We still have some weak cold fronts coming down from the north, triggering a bunch of thunderstorms and a lot of variation in the barometric pressure, which barometric pressure is huge when it comes to fishing. And down here in Corpus Christi, springtime means high winds. It is always windy in the spring down here. The moon phase was a waning gibbous, which means that it's on the downhill side of being full. It's getting smaller each night. And it's said that a new moon and a full moon are the best two moon conditions or moon phases for fishing. Whether or not you believe that is up to you. I know a lot of people have their own theories on the moon. In fact, a lot of people say that fishing during a full moon is best at night because it illuminates things better and the fish are out feeding all night long. So I personally have never spent much time associating the moon phase with how the fishing is, but maybe it's something that I should start doing a little more often. All right, well, let's pull up some graphs and take a look at this thing, see what we've got. All right, the first graph that I want to look at is the tide. So let's see on here. We started at 6:48 in the morning, which would have been somewhere in here. I'm going to put a little S for start. And we finished at 9:10 in the morning. So as you can see, we had a pretty substantial incoming tide the entire time we were fishing, which is a really good thing. Like I've said in previous videos, water movement is key for inshore saltwater fishing. So we definitely had that going on. If you remember in the video, it took us a while to find those fish. We didn't start catching fish until the very end of our trip, right before that storm hit. Looking at this chart, this wouldn't explain why we struggled to catch fish early on and only caught them later on in our trip, considering it was a pretty uniform increase of tide the entire time we were out there. All right, the next one I want to take a look at is the wind speed and direction. So in the video, you'll remember me saying that it was really windy all night long, and that's what really churned up the waters and made those waters muddy. And we had some really strong winds come through last night and just really churn up the bay. Well, you can see right in here, that shows that wind speed. It was blowing out of the northeast all night long, and it got, gusts almost up to 35 miles per hour. So that's definitely enough wind speed to muddy up the bay. So let's put some lines on here as to when we started. So 6:48, all right, to 9:10. All right, so the winds were decreasing while we were out there. They were still fairly high. When we started, they were blowing about 15 miles an hour, as you can see right here. And then we had a steady decrease in wind speed the entire time we were out there. But take a look at this. So we had winds out of the east-southeast, and then all of a sudden, we had a major shift in direction right out of the west. And then it started shifting to the north. So, and you can see right here this peak in wind speed. This is when that thunderstorm started to hit. So we started catching fish. Let's see, the first fish caught of the morning was at 8:20 a.m. So it would have been somewhere in here that we caught the first fish. Okay? The winds were calm and they were getting calmer in a hurry. The second fish, Mitchell's fish, was caught at 8:35 a.m. So just right after that, if this is 6, 7, 8, we'll say somewhere in here was the second fish caught. Third fish was caught at 8:53, so just right after it. And in the video, I talk about how calm the waters get and how active the fish got. Well, it is just beautiful right now. The wind has died down. You can see out on the horizon that storm is getting pretty close. So this was a major change in the morning where the tide wasn't. The tide was pretty much the same the entire trip. But this, it went from being fairly windy to almost zero in a matter of an hour. And all of those fish were caught as that wind was dropping off. So, you know, that could be because maybe the water was so muddy that the fish were having a hard time finding our baits with the wind on top. You know, that chop on the water and the water condition made it difficult for the fish to find our baits. And maybe once that water calmed down and became like glass, they could pick up on other bait where it was, and they could pick up on our baits. So that could explain some of it right there. But I think the big one is going to be barometric pressure. So let's put some lines on here again. So as you can see, the pressure was just plummeting all night long. And this was due to that approaching thunderstorm, I think. As that storm moved closer, the pressure began to drop. That's usually how it works. The pressure is going to fall as your storm approaches, and then once the storm hits, the pressure increases. Typically, fish bite on a pressure decrease, and typically, fish are more reluctant to bite on a pressure increase. So you can see when we first got out there, the pressure wasn't doing much. It was kind of at a standstill as this storm was approaching. But once that storm got closer and started hitting right in here, the pressure just shot up and we ended up stopping right here. It died. So my guess is that we probably caught those fish right here, right before that pressure shot up. Maybe those fish, they could pick up on the fact that the pressure was about to just shoot up, and they were more active right before it happened. But it is pretty interesting to see that we caught really all of our fish. The last fish, again, was caught at 8:53. This is 8:56 right here. So, yeah, all the fish were caught in here right before that pressure jumped up. So that's pretty interesting to see. All right, this is just air temperature. This one comes into play more in the afternoon. There's really not much to talk about in the morning. I'll go ahead and put the lines on here when we started, and then 9:10. It increased as the morning went on, and then after that storm hit, it just started to fall. That storm came in and really cooled things off. So this might play into the fishing trip somehow. If it does, I really don't know how. If any of y'all have a theory on how air temperature played into our fishing trip that morning, leave me a comment and let me know. But I do have a theory for the evening, how temperature plays into that. And let's talk about the terrain of the fishing spot, where we were fishing. So we were fishing this big flat right here. I'll just go ahead and circle this. This is where we were fishing. As you can see, it's a big sand flat with quite a bit of grass, not a ton, although I think there's more out there now than this image shows. But it gets really shallow up in here. And this is where we caught those fish. It was real close to the shore like this. So those fish were up on this flat chasing bait. They weren't out in the deeper water, and they weren't even really tucked up in the grass beds. They were out in the sand just cruising around eating whatever they could before that storm hit. Okay, that was the morning trip. Now I want to run through the same thing for the evening trip because things were a little bit different in the evening. So again, let's start with the tide. The evening trip started at 2:39, so somewhere in here. Okay, we started, and we finished up the trip at 7 o'clock, 7:04. So we're going to put it right here. All right, this one is a little more interesting because you can see right in here, that was pretty much a slack tide. There is no water movement. And if you remember from the video, I went a long time without catching a fish. The wind picked up, I did some wade fishing because of it. I fished and fished and fished and didn't even have a bite. And this can explain why. A slack tide is a bad thing. If there's no water movement, then the fish are probably not going to be active. So this explains it, where right in here, you know, a little after 5 o'clock, that tide really starts to drop out and give us a little more water movement. All right, as far as winds go, let's throw some lines up here. There's the start and finish of the evening trip. In the beginning of that trip, I made a comment about how the winds weren't bad. I said they were blowing probably 9 or 10 miles an hour. The wind is not super strong. It's probably blowing, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 miles an hour, something like that. But then, shortly after that, they increased big time. The wind has dramatically increased, and that's when I actually got out of the kayak to wade fish. So you can see right in here, the winds picked up to gusts of about 20 miles an hour. So that's why I ended up beaching my kayak and getting out and doing some wading, because it just got too windy. The wind is increasing and the tide is pretty much slack right here. So I wade fished for about 3.5 hours without getting a bite. Okay, so here's what the pressure was doing. Coming off of that thunderstorm, the pressure was really high, and as it started to move out of our area, that pressure started to drop back down a little bit. But there's something else about pressure that I wanted to mention. As the air temperature increases, the molecules in the air get more excited and they spread out. And that causes the air to actually be less dense and cause less pressure. Something to remember in the summertime for sure is as the afternoon heats up the air, you can actually see a small pressure drop, which can trigger a bite sometimes. And I think that might have been what happened this evening. As the temperature increased, see, look at this. As the temperature increased, we actually had a drop in pressure. So I do think that had something to do with the evening bite that I did experience. Okay, and let's look at where I was fishing. So this is where I was, and the wind direction was right out of the northeast. And it was a strong wind. Let's see, it was blowing, it had dropped to about 15 miles an hour. So we had a strong 15 mile an hour wind blowing right into this shoreline. I mean, the wind was perfectly perpendicular to this shoreline, and it was just beating this shoreline up. The waves were crashing over it. In fact, I even got washed up in my kayak against it at one point.
Whoa, we gotta get out of here.
And I think what was going on, you can see we've got grass all in here. And this is a pretty shallow sandy bottom. And then out here, it drops off pretty quickly. So those redfish and trout can hang out in this deep water and get up into the shallow sand and grass really easily. And I think what might have been going on was that strong wind was blowing bait out of this deep area up into the shallows and kind of holding them, pinning them against this shoreline. And so this was just loaded with fish. So for our morning trip, I think the kicker was a major change in barometric pressure and a complete die-off of the wind. Right before that storm hit, it just really turned on. The pressure was about to increase and those fish could pick up on it, and the water finally got calm enough where they could see our baits and really pick them up in that muddy water. And I think what happened in the evening was the pressure continued to fall after that storm came through, and that strong wind, along with a little bit of tidal movement, was able to push some bait up against that shoreline and hold them there and really allow those fish to get in there and feed. Okay, and I want to show you real quick the baits that I was using, because that's also something that is a pretty major factor. So in the morning, I was throwing this guy here. This is a bone diamond down south lure, the smaller of the two sizes. And I had it rigged up weedless with this spinner on the underside of it. And they call this thing a flashy spinner. So my idea was in that chop and in the muddy water, this would cause enough vibration to help those fish key in on it and pick it up. Something that I could have done different is I could have put a darker soft plastic on. You know, as far as color goes, the one rule that I try to follow is darker baits in murky water, lighter baits in clear water. So I didn't really follow my own rule with this lighter colored bait. I definitely could have put on something darker and maybe increased my odds a little bit. But I did catch a fish with this one, and I think this spinner probably helped in the muddy water. All right, the second fish of the morning was caught on one of these gamblers. I had it tied on because it does have a pretty large profile. It's a little bit fatter than the down south lures. It's also the darker color. So my hope was that they would be able to pick up on this darker color in the muddy water. And it worked. I ended up catching that second and nicer redfish that morning. In the evening, I continued to throw those two soft plastics, this down south lure here and this gambler. And I had no luck, no bites whatsoever. So what ended up working was tying on a gulp mullet. Just one of these little swimming mullet, a chartreuse color. And I tied it underneath a popping cork. And this is just your typical H&H popping cork that you can get from Walmart or Academy or any bait store. And what I think did it for me was I was popping this very aggressively. I was popping it as hard as I could and pretty much all the way back to the shoreline. And I think what that did was allowed those redfish and trout to pick up on my bait. It had enough sound and vibration to where they could really key in on it, even though the water was super choppy and muddy. Gulp mullet under a popping cork is what caught all of those fish that evening.
I really want this channel to be a community of information sharing, where we can get on here and we can talk about fishing tips and tricks and where to go and patterns and just things that we're seeing out there. If you see something in last week's video that I'm missing that you think is important, that might actually explain why the fishing turned out to be pretty decent, then feel free to leave a comment and let us know. And if you like this video, then do me a favor and give me a thumbs up so that I know that you like it. I think it would be kind of cool to continue doing these over time, and that way we can all come back, you know, years from now and reference these videos to see if we can pick up on some patterns. Well, thanks for watching this week, y'all. I hope you enjoyed the video. Y'all have a great week, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Those burnt chicken, dude. You can blame it on Timbo's chicken.